1950. Tamanu Creek wasn't just a small waterway buried deep on the edge of the lower Umin-Kajuput forest, nor was it merely a streak of the black water that dripped sluggishly year-round beneath ancient Tamanu canopies, dense reeds, and thatched roofs so low that an outsider looking in would feel as though the entire hamlet were bowing its head to avoid something falling. Tamanu Creek felt like an old wound on the body of the Southwest. A deep, black, stubborn gash where the water didn't wash away sins but kept them in mud, in alum, in the stench of rotting fish, in the heavy thuds of falling Tamanu fruits, the dead of nights like someone buried beneath the Yepnis earth, knocking their fists back up against the surface of the world. By day, if a stranger happened to row past, they would only see a scattering of rooftops, slick muddy banks, women hunched over washing clothes on wooden docks, and men setting traps, catching fish, and building bayous, living so poor that with every coming monsoon they had to inspect their roofs the way they inspected their own fate. But when evening fell, the face of the creek changed colors very quickly. The black of the water no longer looked like water, but like bruised flesh breathing slowly beneath duckweed, occasionally stressing with faint, silent streaks of purple, like an old bruise pressed from the inside. People said the water was stained with alum. It didn't, and fell silent. Because anyone who lived there long enough knew that explanations were only meant for the daylight. And when night came, nobody truly believed them. At Tamanu Creek, goat stories were never told with the excited voices people used for cheap thrills as out at the market. The others told them in a very even, low, matter-of-fact tone, the same way they reminded their grandchildren to tie up the boats before sleep, to never walk alone past the shrine after the full moon of the 7th month, to never call out the names of the dead by the water's edge, and to never ask why. Some uncertain nights, the creek echoed with the faint groans of a woman, sometimes sounding like childbirth, sometimes like a stritzbracat, and sometimes like a newborn baby crying, without breath. They called it the wail of the firstborn ghost. Someone once made the mistake of going out to catch frogs, stepped into an unnaturally cold patch of water, and came home to a 3-day fever, mumbling in delirium. "Mom, please don't pull my leg," someone else, on a rainy night, heard, the sound of hair brushing against the thatched walls. When morning came, they found a clump of black algae, tangled into a lock on the back dock, reeking of blood. But of all the things that made Tamanu Creek place outside to spend the night, no was shunned as heavily as Mary. People never said her name out loud after dark. The elders, chewing betel, would stop their jaws if they heard it mentioned. Women would pull their children close to the walls. Even men in the middle of drinking would lower their voices as if speaking just a fraction louder would allow the thing that once bore her name to hear them from somewhere down in the creek and turn its face toward their homes. Mary is to be beautiful, not the generally beauty of a girl with land and brothers to protect her, but a dangerous kind of beauty in a poor hamlet. A place where a beautiful woman without power was no different from a lantern left in a dark field for every insect, every wild beast, and every glaring eye of the world to find. Her skin was fair, a whiteness that didn't belong under the harsh, alum-stained sun of Min. Her eyes were long, her thick black hair fell to her waist, and her lips were always as red as if she had just bitten into an annatto seed. She walked with the sound of fish slowed down. When she bent down to scoop water, the men stared longer than necessary. If she smiled at someone, that man would be glared at like a knife by his wife for days afterward. And in a place where people only needed an excuse to turn their curiosity into that beauty soon became a sin. People said Mary was having an affair with a married landowner from the upper village. They promised to marry her, promised to buy her a brick house on the main riverbank, promised to take her away from Tamanu Creek, where poverty clung to a woman's hair like the smell of kitchen smoke. They said his wife attacked her right in the middle of the market, dragging her by the hair past the fish stalls, tearing her clothes, forcing her to kneel before the crowd, while he refusing to acknowledge her, refusing to help her, without saying a single word. No one knew which parts were true and which parts were just fuel added by the mouths of gossips. But at Tamanu Creek, the truth was powerful, was for a child cleaner than the person they were talking about. When Mary's belly grew, they stopped calling her by her name. They called her by lower, filthier words. Words that dropped behind her back like mud splashings onto a shirt. When she went to the creek to wash clothes, the other women gathered their basins and she to buy salt. Mrs. Bass at the spot dropped the packet on as if afraid to touch her hand. Even when she locked herself side, the whispers still slipped through the thin thatched walls like smoke. If her lamp was put out late, the next morning someone would claim they saw the shadow of a man. If her lamp was put out early, they would say she must have gone off somewhere to learn dark magic. An abandoned woman in a small village is never just abandoned by one man. She was abandoned by the entire village little by little through their stares, their laughter, and the deliberate silence that fell whenever she stepped into a yard. Then one day, Mary disappeared for nearly a month. Nobody saw when she left. Her house was shut tight, the hearth, the clothesline completely bare. Some said she eloped with the landowner. Some said she had traveled all the way to Cambodia to find a black magic sorcerer. Some claimed they saw her boat missing from the dock on a rainy night, yet the oars were still propped up inside her house, so who was rowing? When she returned, her belly was still large. But her face was no longer the face they knew. No more crying. No more bowing her head. More of the trembling of someone desperately clinging to the last shreds of her dignity. Zook the vittles with bone-dry eyes, as though during that lost month she had left a soft piece of herself behind somewhere and brought back something much colder. Her lips darkened. Dark circles ringed her eyes. The smell inside her house changed too. At first, it was just a faint whiff. Strange roots, burnt oil, rotting leaves, and a metallic tang like blood drying in the sun. Later, that smell grew so thick that anyone walking past refused to take a deep breath. Late at night, people heard her muttering inside, unclear if it was Vietnamese or some other tongue. Some like breathing, like talking to someone lying right beneath the floorboards. Someone saw her rowing out of the creek at the third watch, only returning before the roosters crowed. While her hair remained dry. The rumor that she had learned the dark arts of the Ma Lai grew rapidly. It crawled from one kitchen to another yard, from the drinking mats to the vegetable baskets, from the mouths of adults into the ears of children. And after only a few months, Mary was no longer just a scorned woman. She had become a possibility, a terror just waiting for proof. And then the proof appeared. Exactly in the way the villagers wanted it to. First, chickens at Bill's house dried up a coop, no marks on their necks, sharks pale, eyes at sauce, skin wrinkled as if every drop of water had been sucked out. People still suspected a weasel. Then Thomas's yellow dog found dead on the porch, tongue hanging out, all four legs stiff, no blood around its mouth, but its body was unnaturally light. Lifting it felt like picking up a sack of skin over bones. People started casting glances toward Mary's house. But it wasn't until Toby's buffalo died on a night of drizzling rain, collapsed on the edge of the paddy field, untorn, organs intact, a body so massive, yet completely drained of blood, its eyes wide open and nostrils foaming with a black froth, that the village's fear finally found a place to root. And once fear takes root, it no longer needs truth to water it. It survives on its own, feeding on looks and glances. On a night in the 7th month of that year, Matthew rowed his boat out to fish near the deepest stretch of Tamanu Creek. He was the wealthiest man in the hamlet. He had land, he had livestock, he had a voice. He usually wasn't afraid. It's not true. Because a man with money in the deep country often had to act like he feared nothing. So the poor would have something to lean on. But that night the fog draped over the creek like a burial shroud. The oil lamp hanging at the bow of the boat flickered weakly. Every time the forest winds swept past, the flames cross-shrunk as if trying to hide inside the wick. The sound of the oars hitting the water didn't echo out but was swallowed back down by the blackness beneath. As Matthew bent down to bait his hook, he heard a very soft plop near the Kajaput bank, like someone dropping a pebble into the water. He looked up. Floating amidst the fog was the head of a woman. Long, soaking wet hair clung in clumps, covering half her face. But below the head, there was no body. There was only a trailing cluster of bright red intestines, a heart liver and lungs swinging below it. Every time the thing drifted, the organs rubbed together, letting out a hollow, wet, cold sloshing sound, like someone squeezing a handful of bloody algae in the dark. Its eyes were blood red. The mouth was torn wide to the ears. The teeth were needle sharp. Slime dripped relentlessly down the tangle of guts. Matthew tried to chant a Buddhist prayer. His tongue stiffened as if caught between a pair of invisible jaws. The head slowly turned to look at him. And in the brief moment the oil lamp flickered across it, he recognized the face. Mary. Not just a resemblance. It was Mary. The same eyes, the same mouth. Only the beauty that once made the men of the village swallow hard was now stretched into a ravenous hunger that froze the blood in his veins. The head darted past the bow of his boat, leaving behind a draft that reeked of blood mixed with burning hair. Matthew threw his fishing rod and rowed back like a man chased by demons, stammering Namo Amitabha Buddha until he hit the shores. From Shar himself a blanket and huddled the hearth until morning, his teeth still chattering uncontrollably. The next morning, when Thomas rode over to announce that Toby's buffalo had been drained of blood, Matthew's wife only needed to hear half the sentence before clutching her chest and crying out, "It's the Ma Lai. It's definitely the Ma Lai." And within a single morning, Matthew's house was packed with people. Mrs. Bates from the shop, Hannah the herbalist, Thomas, the men from around the hamlet, and even a few children peeking from the porch. Matthew sat draped in his blanket, his face pale as ash, recounting again and again the flying head, the trailing guts, the red eyes, the stench of blood, and every time he got part where he recognized the face, he shuddered as if someone had poured ice water down his spine. Mrs. Bates was the first to speak the name everyone was already thinking. "I suspect it's Mary." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to silence the room. I'm telling you the truth, she hooked up at that rich man and got tossed aside. See, and a few days ago, I even heard folks at that say she went looking for a Cambodian sorcerer to learn dark magic. Lately she's been cooped up inside, face pale green, lips black, eyes darting everywhere. Now a buffalo was dead, and Matthew saw a flying's head. What more are we waiting for? Hansa set her teacup down. She was the village healer, a woman of few words with sad eyes, her hands always smelling of wild herbs. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "We need proof for everything." Saying things like that is a sin against her. That sentence dropped like a small pebble into a raging flood. It wasn't enough to stop it. Mrs. Bates shot her a glare and gave a cold laugh. "A sin? Was Toby's buffalo not a sin? What if tomorrow it sucks the blood of our children? Who'll answer for that?" Hannah pressed her lips together. She knew she was standing in front of a wall built not of reason, but for fear. And fear, once it gathers into a crowd, always gives itself the right to commit the acts of death in the name of preserving life. The village decided to call for Agatha. Agatha had tended the shrine beneath the old Tamanu tree at the head of the creek for years. She was a renowned sorceress. Even people from distant towns claimed to her to collect charms for wealth, love, or peace in their homes. Agatha wasn't tall or imposing, but after she walked into a room, the space naturally seemed to shrink. Her face was long, one eye clouded over, and the left side of her face was a rough, burnt earth-colored birthmark that stretched from down to her chin, tugging her lip into a slight crookedness. The rest of her face was wrinkled. Her right was that whoever sat across from her felt sud as if their outer skin were being peeled away. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to wave her arms. Agatha was terrifying because she knew exactly when to stay silent, exactly where to look, and how to say a single sentence that convinced the crowd they were finally allowed to be afraid. When they reached Mary's house, the door was slightly ajar. They called out, but no one answered. Marcus, Agatha's 15-year-old nephew, pushed the door open. A sharp, foul stench of blood surged out, making several people outside gag. Inside it was pitch black, despite being broad daylight. On the stove an earthen pot was boiling violently, the water inside black, white froth bobbing on the surface like crushed eyeballs. In the middle of the room, Mary lay rigid on the wooden bed, her lips black, her face ashen, both eyes staring wide at the ceiling, her body unnatural shriveled, as if she herself had been sucked dry of something from the inside. In the corner of the room stood her 8-year-old daughter, Lily. leaning against a wooden pillar with her horrorless roots, her stark, bottomless eyes locked onto her mother's corpse. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. She didn't call out for her mother. She just stood perfectly still, as if the whole world had just died and it wasn't yet her turn to react. The woman backed away. "Mrs. Bates whispered, "Good God, her face looks exactly like her mother's." Ath spoke straight in, flipped over the mat under the bed, and pulled out a bundle of strange roots, several small jars filled with a dark red substance mixed with hair and a few talismans with smeared ink. She swept her gaze across the room, her voice as dry as a rotting branch. She really was practicing the Ma Lai dark arts. No one asked if the evidence was sufficient. No one asked where those things came from, who planted them, whether Mary used them, or if someone knew for a fact that this house was going to be searched. Because when Agatha finished speaking, the answer already had an owner. Mary's death was no longer just a death. It was a problem that needed to be dealt with. Agatha crossed her arms, stared at the corpse, and said slowly, "When a Ma Lai dies and is buried in the earth, 3 days later it climbs out of its grave to suck blood again. Take her out to the Tamanu tree in front of the shrine. Burn her to ashes, mix the ashes with talismans, and bury them beneath an iron stake. Lock her away." Someone looked at Lily. "What about the little girl?" Agatha turned to her. Lily bowed her head the second she met the woman's eyes. Not out of reverence or fear, but from the raw instinct of a child who realizes the biggest beast in the forest is staring at her. Agatha said, "She's still young. To kill her now would be murder. Leave her be. If she ever follows in her mother's footsteps, we'll deal with her then." The village nodded in agreement, feeling that cruel kind of relief of people who have just spared a child's life while simultaneously stripping her of the right to be human. That afternoon, Mary's corpse was placed on a pyre beneath the Tamanu tree. The tree was old, its canopy spreading low, its round fruits littering the ground like blind eyes, was let out to stand off to the side. Nobody asked if she wanted to watch. Nobody covered her eyes. Agatha held the incense and yellow paper talismans, her mouth whispering incantations. Marcus lit the torch. The frisk caught Mary's hair first, giving off a sickly sweet, burnt odor before licking at her clothes and her skin. The crackling sound of burning fat mingled with the muffled chants of Agatha, the held breaths of the villagers, and the heavy thuds of Tamanu fruits falling in the background. Lily stood perfectly still. The red glow of the fire flooded her eyes. A normal child might have cried, might have screamed, might have run forward to call out for her mother. But Lily just watched. She watched until the beauty that the entire village had scrubbed and loathed turned to charcoal. Until her one and only muster was reduced to ashes so that the crowd could sleep in peace. Some people later said that it was in that exact moment the little girl lost her soul. But saying that is too easy. The truth is, her soul was still there. It's just that from that day forward, her soul no longer believed in the living. Mary's ashes were mixed with white powder, poured into a jar, and buried beneath the Tamanu tree. An iron stake was driven into the dirt. Talismans were pasted all around. Agatha whispered to the earth, "Lie still. If you dare crawl up, I'll shatter your soul into pieces." Lily heard every single word. She stood there until the very last person walked away. Until the ashes were still smoldering beneath the dirt. Dark spilled over the ground, and the creek wind blew the stench of burning hair right back into her face. From that day on, Lily lived alone in her mother's old house. No one came to visit. No one called her over for meals. No one dared let their children play with her. Children would run when they saw her, screaming Child as they fled. Adults but still stole sideways glances. Mrs. Bates wouldn't sell to her on credit. Whenever Thomas got drunk, he would shout across the yard that they should have burned her clean away when she was little. Marcus, Agatha's nephew, would tease her when he was younger, but as he grew older, he started looking at her differently, a dirty, skinned cook, furious because the very thing the whole village despised was growing more beautiful every day, like a living act of defiance. Only Hannah, the village healer, would sneak over occasionally to bring her a little rice, some medicinal herbs, or an old patched shirt. She didn't dare stay long, not because she hated Lily, but because she too feared the eyes of the village. Her kindness was like tiny dark rainfall, just enough to show there was still light. but never enough to keep anyone warm. Lily grew up in that coldness. She learned how to never ask why she was hated. She learned how to eat less so she wouldn't have to beg. She learned how to bow her head out when walking through the dirt mud so walksmen wouldn't have to sink their children into their arms. How not to lock her door before nightfall, because there's knocks that came not from ghosts but from men. At 19, Lily was even more beautiful than Mary had been. That was her second sin. A girl called a demon is chased if she is ugly. But if she's beautiful, she is desired and then chased away even harder. Because lust makes people hate the victim so they don't have to hate themselves. Marcus started loitering around her house. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with rough hands used to wielding brute strength as his only language. At first, he brought fish and firewood. Lily refused them. Later he smirked and jeered from the porch. Lily locked the door. Once, he cornered her on the way to fetch water, saying, "Be mine and I'll talk to Aunt Agatha for you. From now on this village won't dare touch you." Lily looked at him, lifting her chin to face someone from the village for the very first time. "Whether this village touches me or not, up to." Marcus slapped her. Not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to split her lip. Then he stood frozen. Because Lily didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even rub her cheek. She just looked at him with the same eyes that had watched her mother burn to ashes. And in that gaze, there was something that made Marcus feel much smaller, much dirtier, and much weaker. From that day on, he didn't just want her anymore. He wanted to break her. Right on the full moon of the 7th month, the iron-trimmed stake beneath the Tamanu tree was pulled up. The talismans were torn. The ash jar was dug up. The next morning, Agatha saw it, and her face went chalk white. Not from surprise, but because she very quickly turned her fear into power. She called for the astrologers, dragged Thomas out to repeat the story of the dark shadow he had seen on his drunken walk home the night before. Thomas hadn't seen a face, but he swore for the shadow ran toward Lily's house. That was all it took. The village immediately had its answer. They marched to Lily's house, kicked the door in, and tore apart her blankets, mats, pots, and the corners of her bed. Inside, they found a black outfit soaked in mud, the tiny jar of ashes Lily had kept from her mother, and several bundles of strange roots and talismans buried in the dirt floor. No one asked whose talismans they were. No one asked how Agatha knew exactly where to look. She only had to open the jar, bring the ashes to her nose. Essences. "It's her," she released her mother. "She's practicing the dark arts now too." At that exact moment, a newborn baby in Mrs. Bates's family died, only a few days old. Shriveled up, white lips, wrinkled skin, its umbilical cord completely dried out, looking as if every drop of blood had been drained. Mrs. Bates clutched her dear child and ran to Hannah's house, screaming until her throat was raw. The village didn't need to think anymore. The Sid child is always strongest justification for any atrocity adults want to commit. They hunted for Lily all day. She hid down soaking in the black water amidst the dense reeds, listening to voices calling her name exactly the way they would call for a wild beast. By late afternoon, Marcus caught her. He grabbed her by the hair, hauled her up the bank, tied her wrists with coarse rope, and dragged her through the mud. Lily didn't fight back. Or she was just exhausted from spending her life fighting, a famous sentence that was never formally read aloud. That night, beneath the Tamanu tree in front of the shrine, the whole village gathered with torches, lanterns, mulberry branches, and faces that had granted themselves the right to be terrified. Lily was tied to the dead Taman's tree that had been struck by lightning, the exact spot where her mother had burned. Her skin looked sickly pale in the firelight, her long, black hair plastered wetly against her torn gray shirt, her lips swollen from being slapped, her wrists bleed from the prescriptions. But she didn't beg. She didn't deny the charges. She didn't cry for justice. That silence infuriated them, because a mob always wants its victim to cry. So they can feel like they are punishing evil, rather than murdering a human being. Marcus stood close to her, his breath heavy with the stench of alcohol, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "Because you wouldn't have me. If you had just been mine, it wouldn't have come to this." Lily didn't look at him. He sprang again, but his hand was trembling. There are cowards who only for just murmurs from fur and fear, and the moment they aren't feared back, they suddenly see their own naked patheticness. Agatha stepped forward, clutching her ritual bell and talismans. She looked at Lily with eyes that were cold, controlling, and almost so pitying, but it was the kind of pity an executioner gives to the condemned. "Lily," she said, her voice slow so everyone could hear. "I found your mother's ashes and talismans. I saw the charms in your house. Sister Bates's grandchild didn't die naturally. When you were little, I gave you a path to live, but you didn't know how to cherish your own life. When you die today, don't blame me. I am doing this for the village." That is the most dangerous phrase. For the village. It twists a crime into a duty. It makes the weak wills to stand up straighter. Allows cowards to kiss themselves as they are being brave. Hannah ran up late, the lantern in her hand, shaking violently. Sweat soaking her forehead. "Murder is the law. Please don't kill her. If she really hurts someone, report it to the authorities, let them handle it. What you're doing is murder." Matthew stood amidst the crowd, his face tense. He didn't want to kill Lily, but he also didn't want to stand against the village. His whole sup, he had been used to being the man with a voice. But that voice was only powerful when it echoed the shared fears of everyone else. If he tried to stop this now, he would stand alone. And no one is rich enough to not fear being cast out by the whole village as a protector of ghosts. Mrs. Bates clutched the swaddling cloth of the dead baby and screamed. "She killed my grandchild. If we don't kill her, who do we kill?" Hannah turned to her, eyes red. "Did you see her do it? Did you see it with your own eyes?" Mrs. Bates choked, then pointed a trembling finger at Lily. She had talismans in her house. Her mother was a Ma Lai. She is the spawn of a Ma Lai. Is that not enough? The whispers swelled like floodwater. Thomas stepped out, his face flushed with booze and terror. "Enough. What do women know anyway? Let the men handle this. If we let her live, whose children are going to die tomorrow?" He looked at Agatha. She gave a very slight nod. That nod was a death sentence. Thomas grabbed a torch and walked forward. The firelight painted his face as both savage and pale, like a man forced to play the villain who desperately tries to convince himself he is the hero. To Lily. "You are a demon. We should have burned you back then. We took pity on you and let you live, but who knew you'd turn out exactly like your mother? I'm going to burn you now. So in your next life you can be reborn as a proper human being." Lily finally looked at him. A very long look. There was no hatred. There was no begging. It was as if she were trying to memorize every single feature, every single mouth, every single pair of eyes standing before her. Then he threw the torch. Fire caught the Tamanu oil that had been poured around the base of the tree, leaping up her clothes as fast as a speak of an eye. Lily became a living torch. Her scream ripped through the Kajuput forest, across the black water of the creek, through the tightly locked house, piercing through all the rumor there's a drug to this moment. People stumbled backward. Some covered their faces. Some wretched. Some wept but didn't dare step forward. Hannah lunged ahead but was held back tightly by Matthew. She thrashed, cursed, and cried. But like all kindness that arrives too late, she wasn't strong enough to defeat a mob that had already bloodied its hands. "Samists," Lily shrieked, her voice warped by agony. "I will have my revenge. You will never know peace. I will have my revenge." And then her head slumped forward. The fire continued to burn. The smell of hair, skin, fabric, and Tamanu oil twisted together, so suffocatingly heavy that many people later swore they could still smell it in their mosquito nets for a whole month. But no one told the authorities the truth. A few days later, Matthew reported that Lily's house had caught fire. They couldn't save it in time. She was missing and had likely burned to death. The officials came, saw the house reduced to ashes, couldn't find a body, and ultimately let it go. Because in those days in the deep country, there were too many deaths for anyone to bother digging down to the roots. Tamanu Creek went quiet again. But it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the silence of a belly digesting its own sins. 10 years passed. 1972, war, famine, malaria, crocodiles, and the deep jungle had taken turns swallowing many generations of lives. But the Tamanu tree in front of the shrine still stood, the creek was still black, and the water still glimmered with a faint purple tint, and days when the sunlight was Hannah had aged deeply. Her back was more hunched, her eyes hollow. She spoke less, and her subsistence still prepared herbal medicines for the village. Though they were no longer quick. She lived with Leah, an 11-year-old adopted granddaughter she claimed to have found abandoned in the forest while gathering herbs. Leah was scrawny, with long hair and a vicious scar under her left eye that made her naturally quiet face even harder to approach. The village children refused to play with her. Adults warned their kids to stay away from the long-haired girl at Hannah's house, whispering about her unknown origins. Leah was used to being stared at, through the fence. Used to the stopping the moment she walked near. Small house fused by was smooth the smell of herbs, the sharp scents of burning Tamanu wood, and the sounds of her adopted grandmother, see more than she spoke. But then, the 7th month of that year arrived, and the dreams began. On the first night I dreamed of a woman tied to the Tamanu tree, in front of the shrine. Her gray shirt erupted in flames, her black hair writhed in the fire, her white skin turned searing red and then black. Screams of agony that when Leah woke up, her own throat felt raw, as if she had been screaming. All night, she saw Thomas torch, saw Mrs. Bates crying with eyes full of hatred, saw Matthew holding Hannah back, saw Agatha standing behind the firelight, one side of her face twisted by a birthmark, her good eye gleaming not with fear, but with a cold, calculating control. The next morning, Leah asked Hannah, "Grandma, was anyone ever burned at the Tamanu tree in our village?" Hannah, who had been stoking the fire to boil medicine, suddenly froze. It was only for a second, but Leah saw it. She stirred the pot, trying to sound normal. "You're just happy dreams. Don't talk nonsense. If Uncle Thomas hears you talking about burning people, he'll beat your head in." "But I heard them Lily." That name made the kitchen turn ice cold. The fire was still burning, but Leah felt as though all the heat had been sucked out of the room. Hannah wouldn't look at her. "That never happened. Sit and watch the medicine." From that day on, Leah knew her grandmother was lying. And a lie from someone who loves you is far more terrifying than a threat from someone who hates you. Because it proves the truth monstrous enough that even love has to hide it. The following afternoon, Leah carried a delivery of medicine to the shrine for Agatha. Agatha was nearing 60 now, thin as a withered branch, one eye completely clouded white, but her good eye was still as sharp as a freshly honed knife. The shrine sat in the deep shade of the old Tamanu tree, its wooden walls low, reeking of old incense, oil, damp earth and something vaguely metallic that never fully faded away. As she walked, Leah heard the sound of crying. Small, choked sobs, impossible to tell if it was a woman or a child. She looked toward the creek and saw a woman in a dark red shirt sit up by the togs. Long hair, pale face, staring at her with eyes that looked as if they had been waiting a very long time. Leah instantly recognized the face from her dream. Lily. She stood frozen to the spot. The woman slowly raised her hand, not waving, just touching her own chest lightly, before turning her face toward the base of the Tamanu tree. Right at that moment, Agatha snapped from right behind her. "What are you looking at?" Leah jumped. She had no idea when Agatha had stepped out, her tall, gaunt frame draped a black shirt and brown headscarf, her right eye staring unblinkingly at the girl. Leah stammered and handed over the medicine. Agatha snatched the bag so violently that a few dried leaves fell to the dirt, then leaned to Leah's face. "What did you just see?" Leah tried to speak, but her throat clamped shut. She shook her head. Agatha smiled, a crooked, lopsided grin. "A child, standing dead still in a place like this, the Stokes are gonna snatch you up and rip your belly open. Next time you come, call out. Stop looking where you shouldn't." She shoved a few coins into Leah's hand, her fingers cold and dry like dead fruits. Leah ran. She tripped once on a thick root, smearing mud on her shirt, but she didn't dare look back. From that day on, the 7th month grew heavier and heavier. Every house offered food for the wandering spirits: ripe bananas, plain congee, raw rice and salt, resin's incense, while children who tried to sneak these offerings were scolded by adults and warned never to call out the names of the ghosts. While delivering tea to Mrs. Bates, Leah listened to the children in the yard swapping tales of the Ma Lai. They all talked about Mary, about the flying head with trailing guts, about Lily being burned alive, about Agatha burying their souls beneath the shrine. Leah sat hidden behind a torn rice sack, hugging the parcel of tea, listening to every word as if someone were poking at a wound inside her head that she didn't even remember getting. She understood that her dreams weren't just nightmares. She was seeing something that had actually happened. But why was she seeing it, and why was Hannah hiding it? That night, she didn't ask. She bathed in the midshipman of boiled leaves Hannah had prepared, a dark brew that smelled so strongly of tamanu it gave her a headache. Her grandmother said she had a cold constitution and needed to steam herself regularly. Leah hated that smell. Every time the herbal vapor rose, she felt as if she wasn't being healed, but rather smoked out with something meant to keep whatever was under her skin asleep. But she was a good girl. She lived in her grandmother's house, was raised by her, and was loved in the quiet, burdened way of an old woman carrying too many secrets, so she didn't dare rebel. But then Leah's body began to change. At night, she started sleepwalking. Hannah would hear the door creak open, grab the lamp, and find the girl standing by the kitchen hearth, her eyes wide open but completely hollow. Her clothes smeared with mud, her hair damp with mist, stepping mindlessly into the yard and, walking straight toward the creek, Hannah would drag her back, her small body as ice-cold as if she had just been submerged in water. In the morning, Leah remembered nothing. Some cyst Hannah heard her crying in her sleep, but it wasn't the Havachais at all. It was the hoarse, ragged wail of a grown woman who had screamed until her throat tore. Leah started craving the smell of raw blood. At first, it was just fish. Whenever Hannah gutted fish in the yard, watching the bright blood spill across the cutting board, in the kitchen staring unblinkingly, her stomach tightening, her mouth watering, her mind consumed by the sudden urge to bend down and lick a warm metallic drop. She was terrified of herself. She would run behind the house and dry heave, but nothing would come up. Another night, she woke up to find herself standing over the fish vat, her hands submerged in the dark water, her fingers stroking the slick skulls, her face pressed close to inhale the stench of blood. Hannah appeared behind her, didn't yell, just wrapped her arms around the girl and pulled her back to bed, her own eyes red with tears. Waiting until Leah fell asleep, she brewed an even thicker pot of tamanu leaves, draped a blanket over the girl to steam her, fanning the hot vapor while whispering frantically, "Please don't be like your mother. Please, please don't be like mother." Leah heard that sentence even with her eyes shut tight. Your mother, not her, not someone else, your mother. The truth was finally beginning to crack. The next day, Leah vanished. Hannah woke up late because she had stayed up all night watching over her granddaughter, and no matter how much she called, there was no answer. The kitchen fire was cold. The medicine pot remained unlit. Out in the yard, tiny footprints led straight toward the creek, disappearing into the black mud. The news of Leah's disappearance spread, but instead of worrying, the village Mrs. Bates shut down her shop early. Thomas muttered that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Agatha sat in her shrine, thumped her prayer beads, a man in his 20s had a glint in his eyes that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. It's happening again, he said. This time, don't let it grow up. Hannah went looking for her alone first. She followed the edge of the creek, calling Leah's name until her voice broke, mud clinging to her knees, mosquitoes swarming her neck and said, I responded, forest echoing the girl's name with a hollow ring. Nearing the base of the Tamanu Creek, she noticed a long drag mark in the damp soil, as if a body had been pulled, though she couldn't tell from where or to where. Right at the base of the tree, exactly where Mary's ashes had been buried, the dirt was slightly raised. She dropped to her knees, hands shaking, and began digging like a mad woman with her bare fingernails. Underneath, she found no bones, no jar, only a scorched scrap of a gray shirt, dripping wet, freezing cold, as if it had just pulled spizzle from the bottom of the creek. Lily, she whispered, and for the first time in 20 years, the name left her lips not as a terrified curse, but as an apology. That evening, Leah returned. No one saw her walk into the house. Hannah was sitting silently in front of the cold hearth when she heard the drip drop of water behind her. Turning around, she saw Leah standing in the doorway, hair dripping, clothes caked in mud, her dark eyes deeper and emptier than ever before. In her hand, she held a single tamanu fruit. "Grandma," she said, her voice terrifyingly small. "What was my mother's name?" Hannah couldn't breathe. She looked at the child she had raised, looked at the pale face, jagged scar beneath her eye, the lips trembling and purple from the cold, and she knew that all her pots of leaves, all her lies, all her years of silent suffering had finally been defeated. She told her the story. Not all at once because her truth was far too heavy to lift in a single breath. She told her that Lily was never a Ma Lai. She told her how mother and daughter had been cursed by the entire village long before they had ever committed a single sin. She told her about the night Lily burned, how she had run to stop it but failed. She told her that after that night, people heard a baby crying in the scorched ruins of Lily's house. And that she was the one who had found Leah, a tiny newborn hidden under an overturned basket out back, her face slashed by a burning splinter of bamboo, but still breathing. She had hidden her, claimed she found her in the forest, raised her on bitter medicine, on water boiled with tamanu leaves, and on the constant, suffocating terror that one day her blood would remember the way home. Your mother was Lily, she said, terrorizing paths through her wrinkles. Your grandmother was Mary. They couldn't save themselves. I couldn't save them either. I could only save you. Leah sat in perfect silence for a very long time. No crying, no screaming. It was that exact silence that terrified her. It looked exactly like Lily on the night she was tied to the tree, like Mary lying rigid on the wooden bed with her eyes wide open. Then Leah asked, "Who burned my mother?" Hannah closed her eyes. The whole village. Leah looked out toward the creek. The night outside was as black as the bottom of a scorched pot. Then why am I the only one called a demon? That question needed no answer. And from that night on, the death spirit returned, not in a massive wave. Not like a biblical plague in a fable. They came slowly, selectively, as cold and calculated as a debt collector opening a ledger. Thomas Us's pigs died first, its body drained dry, its eyes sunken. Thomas cursed at the sky, but that night, he dreamed of a charred, blackened girl standing at the foot of his bed, asking him if he still remembered the torch. He woke up with a swollen tongue. Mrs. Bates suffered night after night of insomnia, because every midnight she heard a baby crying from under her bed. She only ever caught a glimpse of a soaking wet clump of hair retreating quickly into the shadows. Marcus's nightmares were the worst. He dreamed he was tying a girl to a tree, but the rough ropes in his hands turned into human intestines, wrapping backward to strangle his own neck. He would wake up gasping for air, bearing dark, bruise-like figures of a woman around his throat. The entire village began looking toward Hannah's house. Leah never stepped outside, but people swore they saw her standing by the creek's edge in the dead of night. They said her eyes glowed red. They said her hair grew inches every single day. They said that little girl was no longer a child. Eventually, Agatha came to Hannah's house. She didn't march with a mob, she came entirely alone, leaning on her cane, her face as calm and unreadable as it had been 10-20 years ago. Hannah stood in the doorway, blocking her path. "Go home." Agatha looked at her, one eye clouded, the other sharp. "You've hidden her for far too long, Hannah. I raised her. She hasn't hurt anyone." "Are you sure about that?" Agatha asked, her tone softening with a venomous cruelty. "Or are you just like you were back then, wanting to love but completely lacking the spine to bear the consequences?" The words disrupted nerve. Hannah's face drained of color. Agatha steps closer, lowering her voice. You think you saved her? But all you did was prolong something that should have been eradicated. Her mother's death wasn't unjust. Neither was her grandmother's. There are certain bloodlines that simply should not be allowed to continue. Leah stood behind the thin wall, listening to every single word. For the very first time, she understood that demons didn't always have to be flying heads, with dangling guts that drank blood in the night. There was a kind of demon that stood in broad daylight, spoke with a perfectly calm voice, acted in the name of beasts, in the name of the village, in the name of the greater good. And because of that, no one ever realized it was feeding on human flesh through sheer terror. Leah stepped out. Hannah turned around in a panic. Agatha looked at the girl. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the old sorceress's face changed color. Not because Leah looked so much like Lily, but because Leah was looking at her with the eyes of someone who already knew everything. "You burned my mother," Leah said. Agatha didn't blink. "Your mother chose the path of evil. You planted the talismans in my mother's house." That sentence made Hannah freeze in horror. Agatha fell silent. Only for a single beat, but it was enough. Leah took another step forward. And you planted the talismans in my grandmother's house too. The wind outside shifted directions. The harsh, bitter smell of Tamanu swept into the house. Agatha gave a low, dry chuckle. Who told you that? Leah tilted her head, her voice eerily soft. Under the tree. The name wasn't spoken, but they all heard it. Under the tree, where the ashes were buried, where the iron stake was driven, where 2 women had been turned into monsters, so that this entire village could go on living, without having to look at their own sins. Agatha stopped laughing. You don't understand anything. This village needed a name to fear. If they didn't have one, they would have torn each other apart. I only kept things peaceful. By burning people alive, by choosing the lesser death. The confession wasn't loud or dramatic, it was terrifying precisely because of how mundane it sounded. Agatha didn't view herself as evil. She saw herself as the manager of fear, the surgeon cutting away the infected flesh so that the body called Tamanu Creek could survive. Mary was too beautiful, too scandalous, too easy to push into becoming a demon. Lily was too isolated, too much like her mother, too convenient. And Leah was the living proof that she hadn't stamped out all the embers. On the night of the full moon in the 7th month of that year, the mob marched to the shrine once again. History has a horrifying habit. It doesn't always repeat itself perfectly, but it always finds a way to use the exact same stage. The Tamanu tree was still there. The shrine was still there. The torches were still there. The only difference was the person tied up this time was Leah's, smaller, thinner, her eyes deeper, while Hannah was restrained on the outside of the human circle, a cloth stuffed in her mouth so she couldn't scream. Agatha stood before the crowd, her voice carrying that same even authority. This child is no longer a normal human being. She carries the curse of the Ma Lai. If we don't banish it, the whole village will die. Marcus stood nearby holding a thick coil of rope, his face a twisted mask of fear and gloating satisfaction. Thomas, Mrs. Bates, and Matthew, older and weaker now, were each of them dragging along a piece of the past that had desperately tried to bury under ash. Leah didn't thrash against the ropes. She looked at every single person, exactly the way Lily once had, but in her eyes, there wasn't just pain. There were the memories of the women who came before her. Memories that didn't belong to her age, but had been burned directly into her blood. Agatha stepped closer, clutching a talisman. I am giving you one last chance, she whispered. Just softly enough for only Leah to hear. Admit that you are possessed by your mother. Confess, so I can perform the banishing ritual, and everything will be over. I won't burn you. I will keep you locked in the shrine. You can live as long as you never cause troubles again. Leah stared at her. The way my mother lived? Live just to wait for the day you need a new demon? Agatha gripped the yellow paper tight. A child, and yet just as violently stubborn as the rest of them. No, Leah said. I just remember. At that exact moment the wind howling from the creek surged. It wasn't a normal wind. It was freezing, soaking wet, reeking of blood, sweeping across the shrine's yard and forced every single torch to bow down simultaneously. Tamanu fruits began dropping from the branches in rapid succession. Thud, thud, thud. Sounding exactly like the heavy footsteps of someone walking up from under the earth. The bell in Agatha's hand began ringing violently on its own, though no one was shaking it. The dirt at the base of the tree began to swell and heave. The sound of women weeping echoed up from the creek, raised fights, then growing louder, overlapping one voice, 2 voices, dozens of voices. Mrs. Bates shrieked. Thomas collapsed to his knees. Marcus tried to scramble backward, but the his hand suddenly tightened around his own wrists like a living snake. From the pitch-black shadows behind the Tamanu tree, Lily stepped out. She wasn't a flying head with trailing intestines like the rumors had painted her. She wasn't a monster designed to be easily hated. She was a young woman, half her body charred, wearing a dark gray shirt, her wet hair clinging to her shivers, eyes wide, glaring at the village with the final, damning gaze of someone murdered unjustly. Behind her, another woman materialized. Heavily pregnant, long-haired, beauty warped by soot and swamp mud. Mary. No one could speak. Agatha took a step back. For the very first time in her life, she was genuinely terrified. Because the things standing before her weren't the rumors she had fabricated, but the actual, horrifying consequences of those rumors. Lily didn't lunge forward. She only looked at Marcus. He clutched his throat, his mouth gaping wide, but unable to draw a breath. The bruises on his neck darkened into a vivid, rotting purple, as if invisible ropes were strangling him from the inside out. He collapsed, his eyes bulging, his tongue protruding, his hands clawing desperately at the roots tree where he had once tied her. Thomas tried to crawl away on his hands and knees, but the fallen tamanu fruits seemed to roll after him, striking his arms, his head, every thud echoing like the sound of a dropping torch. He turned to Agatha, his face contorted in sheer terror. "Auntie, please save me." But Agatha wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Leah, because Leah was still tied up, still very much alive. But her eyes were no longer the eyes of a child. Hannah finally broke free, sprinting forward to throw her arms around her granddaughter, tearing frantically at the ropes. "Leah, look at Grandma, look at me, don't follow them." Leah looked at the old woman, and in that split second, the terrifying coldness on her face shattered. She was still the little girl Hannah had raised, still the child who hated the smell of boiling tamanu wood, who used to be terrified of Aunt Agatha, who had only wanted to know her mother's name. But standing right behind her were 2 generations of women butchered by a mob that called it an exorcism. She could never go back to being whole again. Agatha suddenly drew a ritual dagger and lunged forward. Not to kill Leah in front of everyone, but to slash her arm, to draw blood and forcefully reseal the curse. She still believed that if she was fast enough, strong enough, and ruthless enough, she could seize control of the story one more time. Hannah threw herself in the way. The blade buried itself deep into her chest. She crumpled into Leah's tied arms. Hot blood soaked through their shirts. Leah screamed, and the sound wasn't that of an adult, nor of a child, but the collective shriek of every single person who had been gagged and silenced, all ripping free at once. The ground beneath the tamanu tree violently cracked open. Agatha was yanked backward. No one saw a hand grab her, they only saw her legs scraping furiously across the dirt, her fingernails snapping off as she clawed at the earth, her voice finally tearing out of her throat in a deafening, panicked screech. The talismans in her hands burst into sickly green flames. She stared at Leah, her eyes bulging with hatred and absolute dread. "Without me, this village will tear itself apart." Leah held Hannah tightly, tears streaming down onto the dying woman's face. "With you, it tore itself apart a long time ago." Agatha was dragged screaming to the very base of the tree. The old iron stake, long thought lost, thrust up from the dirt, rusted red like dried blood. It didn't impale her. There would be no visible death for the living to easily brand as justice. The darkness beneath the tamanu tree split wide open, swallowed the bottom half of her body, and then slowly clamped shut to the violent ringing of the ritual bell. Her screams faded deep beneath the earth, sounding not like someone who had died, but like someone buried in a place where they still stood to breathe. The mob shattered. People ran. People fell. People wept hysterically. No one thought about burning Leah anymore, but no one apologized either. That was the cold part. When the truth finally bares its teeth, human beings don't magically become better people. They simply learn to be afraid in a brand new way. Hannah died before the sun came up. She lay cradled in Leah's arms, her trembling hand to gently touch the vicious scar beneath the girl's eye. "Awesome," she rasped. "I saved you, but I also hid you." Leah held her hand tight, wanting to say it was okay, but the words wouldn't come. Because it wasn't okay. Nothing was okay. An entire life had been hidden away in herbal brews, in smoke of tamanu wood, in warnings to never leave the house, in a love poisoned by far too much fear. But Leah also knew that without her grandmother, she would have died a long time ago. Love at Tamanu Creek was never clean. It was always stained with mud, blood, and suffocating silence. After that night, Agatha was gone. People said she packed up and left. People said the ghosts dragged her away. People said the shrine collapsed on one side, and for days the rubble reeked intensely of burning hair. Marcus died choking on nothing. Thomas lost the ability to speak out of half his mouth, and Mrs. Bates locked up her shop for months, aging rapidly into a frail shell. Matthew never dared look toward the tamanu tree again. The authorities eventually came to ask questions, and once as a sin, the village stayed completely silent. Tamanu Creek went on surviving the exact way every land accustomed to burying its sins survives. by draping a brand new layer of rumors over the truth. Said Leah was stalked by a demon but was ultimately spared. They said Hannah died absorbing the village's karmic debt. They said Agatha had achieved spiritual enlightenment and ascended elsewhere. No one ever said the whole village murdered Mary. No one ever said they burned Lily alive. No one ever said they almost repeated it for a third time on an 11-year-old child. Leah survived. But surviving isn't the same as being saved. She buried Hannah behind the house, placed a fresh bowl of water before the grave every morning, and walked past the ruined shrine without ever bowing her head. She never sleepwalked again. She never craved the taste of fish blood again. But from that day on, she was never afraid of the dark ever again, and that was not a good thing. It's one thing for a child not to feed the dark because they are innocent. Leah wasn't afraid because she very finally understood that the most terrifying assassins always stand right under the torchlight. Right in the middle of the road. Shouting that they are doing it for the village. Many years later, people still saw her living quietly by the creek, speaking little, her eyes bottomless, her hair long, the scar under her eye fading but never truly gone. The Skilsharolska's children walking past her house were still firmly warned not to stare too long. Because adults will always pass down their fears much faster than they pass down the truth. On the pitch-black nights of the 7th month, Tamanu fruits still fall with heavy thuds around the ruined shrine. The creek water remains ink-black. Some claim they still see a young woman in a gray shirt standing beneath the dead tree, a heavily pregnant woman sitting by the water's edge. A sparked old stove ups a fire to boil medicinal herbs in a yard where no one lives anymore. As for Leah, whenever she hears people whispering the words Ma Lai, she simply looks down at the water, watching her warped reflection blend with the shadows of the Kajaput forest, and offers a very faint, knowing smile, because she knows that demons are not born from the blood of women. Demons are born from a village of people too terrified of the truth, too desperate for a scapegoat to burn, and far too used to branding their own atrocities with sacred names. And at Tamanu Creek, the thing buried the absolute deepest was never the corpses. It was the apology that the living never once possessed the courage to say out loud.